Do you struggle with understanding any aspect of realism? I'm going to break down how I got these results, and I'm going to show you how I got these results in a step-by-step manner here in this video. Don't forget to like and share this video if you think someone would find this useful. I will be leaving this stencil for you to download in the description below so you can follow along with me on your end. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'll do my best to assist you in the best possible direction. In this video, I want to talk about how I look at realism, but I'm going to do it in a manner that's simplified and in a manner that's more so basic and introductive. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I'm going to go with that one. So long story short, realism to me involves a lot of ongoing learning. So whenever we are doing a sort of realistic design, it's going to involve multiple variables that we would have learned in the past before we got to that point of accepting a realistic sort of design. I look at being able to do realism as one of the final levels in terms of technicality and technique within tattooing. To me, ongoing learning has been mastering the techniques, learning the ins and outs, mastering all of the fundamentals, being able to line on demand, shade on demand, do dot works, textures, anything that I need to do in terms of tattooing, I can do on demand anytime without fluctuations or any sort of hiccups. To me, in short, ongoing learning is time, effort, practice, and patience over the course of time. You're going to hear me say this a lot on my YouTube channel if you've been subscribed, that there's no way around learning but through it. It does require practice, effort, and patience. Ongoing learning isn't just the technique. It extends to every single part of tattooing, whether we are applying a stencil down to the gear that we choose to use, how we clean up our stations. Every single aspect of tattooing requires ongoing learning. Let me give a visual example of what ongoing learning would look like. So for example, let's say I were early on in my tattooing journey and I'm just starting. Typically how I would have approached this is I would have simply began by lining the outline right here with like maybe an 11 round liner or something like that. So I would have hard lined this entire outline right here. I would have hard lined right here, and then I would have gone back and then done something with a needle right here to try to mimic this as best I can. So the point is, I would have simply used an improper technique for a design that requires the opposite of that. So for example, if I'm going for a realistic design, there's no reason why I should be hard lining. That right there is ongoing learning. The ability to trust a process and apply the technique the way that it's needed to get the results that we need is ongoing learning in itself, in my opinion. Back in the day, if I was doing like animal fur, the same thing would apply. I would tend to outline the fur first and then kind of pack it all in, which would produce funky results. It didn't give me the results that I was looking for, that sort of animal fur texture results. Ongoing learning comes into play here when we start learning and developing to trust the process, when we start learning to trust our technique and what we are doing. Another good example would be ongoing learning. If I were just starting, I would have a tendency to kind of want to outline these areas right here first and then pack them in, which is exactly what I am not going to do. Even for these thicker areas, I'm not going to be outlining anything and or packing it in. Even these areas right here that could be outline deemable, I guess, I'm not going to be outlining those either. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a series of textured whip motions. I'm going to use a series of motions to create textures here to build up this design from ground up. The point of this video is to not only talk about an introduction to realism, but to kind of explain what's required to take on these sort of designs right here. It is essentially ongoing learning. I really feel before we start doing any sort of realistic design, we should be acquainted with lining, whether it's fine lines, even heavier line widths. All lining should be something that's on demand from us. Shading should be on demand, textures, dot work, different tones, all of that, a gray wash system. These are things that should be in play before we begin to start taking on realistic sort of designs. Another point of this video is to demonstrate how I would go about technically applying this sort of realistic design and then touching base on that as well. So from here, with the understanding that I'm not going to be hard lining anything, I can kind of work with that sort of, basis there. So how would I go about doing that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify point A and B and figure out a place to start. And instead of just simply going in there and lining it, I'm going to use a series of strokes, as you see, whether it's whip motions here or a sort of a pendulum motion. And this is what I'm going to do to sort of build up this entire design. Right now I am running at 4.5 volts and I'm using the Stay-Lite tattoo machine, which I will be bringing a full in-depth review on. But you can see though that I am creating textures without any sort of prominent hard lining. You can see both of the edges are sharp right here, and that was exactly what I was going for. I'm going for a prominent mid area with sharper outer areas, like so. And I'm using a series of pendulum and whip motions and tapers to make this happen. That right there is ongoing learning. The ability to know that I'm going to need tapers on the ends of these areas, and the ability to know that this area has to be a bit more thicker than this area. All of this is directly ongoing learning. These are the technicalities that we learn and pick up throughout the process of, again, kind of just learning the ways of tattooing. So I would begin right there and then kind of just start working these surrounding areas. The same thing would apply for the eyebrows. So instead of just kind of hard lining them like normal, I'm going to do the same thing. Use a series of whip motions going back and forth. And on each end, I'm using tapers in and out. And then kind of do some stipple shading over that to kind of add a little bit more saturation. But still, we are avoiding any sort of hard lining. So when I am done and the stencil's wiped away, all of these markings that we're creating are going to be reading as textures should we have done that ongoing learning and are able to anticipate the results that we are going to get. A great way to develop is to also use my tattooing workbooks that I develop. I have multiple workbooks that are designed for textures, line work, shading, statues, you name it. I'll leave my Amazon affiliate links for you in the description below so you can check those workbooks out. So that's the idea behind this technical process. So even right here, for example, how I'm going to go about this is doing the same thing. I'm going to use a series of just kind of whip motions like so. Back and forth pendulum motions like this. Still no hard lining. Although it may read as a hard line, there is definitely no hard lining. There is a different read from this sort of approach versus a hard line, because a hard line would look like this. If I were to hard line these areas, it would look like a hard line, which is accurate to whatever needle size that I am using. That's not the look that I am going for. I do want a more organic sort of look since I am doing textured hair. And then these areas right here, I'm going to taper in. I'm going to bring this down like this and then bring this back and forth. Now you're going to notice that I am sticking with a sort of hardline approach right here, even though I'm kind of preaching not to use any sort of hard lining. However, since I am working this sort of textured inner area right here, in order to get these textures, I'm going to use a combination of whip motions going this way, as well as small hard lines here and there. So that right there is how I feel artistically comfortable to apply this area right here to get these sort of realistic textures that I am looking for. I'm still kind of avoiding just straight prominent hard lining, although I am using that technique. My ongoing learning just kind of allows me to flow and use the techniques as I need, which is kind of sparse and as needed. I can't really necessarily predict. It's a more so of a feel that I feel out as I am doing it. Same thing with right here. Here are some more textures. I'm going to kind of use a series of whip motions. Make sure that you have adequate ink flow. Still avoiding though prominent lining, and it kind of reflects that. So right here, the same thing. There we go. Those whip motions are very, very important and crucial. Same thing. So the idea is just to kind of build up this entire area, trusting the techniques. So you can kind of see though, the read that I'm getting is different from that of prominent hard lining. I think that is exactly ongoing learning, the ability to trust this process. I know which motions I need to flow in. I know which strokes I need to make. I know where more prominent lining should be done for a little bit more of a textured look. All of that has everything to do with the point of this video, which is ongoing learning. So for example, this little area right here, I'm actually going to do a little bit of dashes as you see me doing here, because that area appears to be a little bit more on the textured hair side as opposed to kind of just a straight line going that way. And then I can kind of even it out with some stipple shading this way. Then the same thing right here. So right here, for example, just small textured strokes. A little bit of whip shading right here. I'm going to bring that whip shading on up here. So I'm using a combination now of stipple shading with whips, tapers to create this. So knowing these fundamentals, knowing again, as I mentioned, how to taper, knowing where the whip motions go, knowing when to kind of line a little bit more, all of this, yes, as I mentioned, is ongoing learning. This is why I feel realism is the last level, because if I wasn't comfortable with lining, I wouldn't know how to stay away from dominant lining. If I wasn't comfortable with shading, I wouldn't get smooth results. If I wasn't comfortable with applying textures, I wouldn't be able to get hair sort of results either. So all of this matters when it comes to trying to do realistic sort of designs. The same thing, so I'm going to kind of continue. I'm not going to rush the process as I don't want to lose the integrity of the textures and the brows. But you're going to notice that I'm still using just the very tip of my needle and a series of kind of pendulum whip motions. And on each end of the hair, I sort of use a whip out motion to create that sort of sharp point, like so. So being able to know these things is of the utmost importance. If not, I'm going to kind of be guessing what to do where, as opposed to when I look at it, I know exactly what's what, I know what to do here, I know what I should be doing here. You get the idea. We have to be able to know what we are doing to get the results that we want, especially when we start accepting these sort of realistic style designs. Do a little bit of textures right here with some small circular motions just to create a little shade, as you can see. So you're going to notice that the technique doesn't change. All I do is I'm simply just building up from ground up, and the only thing that changes is where I am applying the technique. So for example, you can see this area is starting to curve a bit, so I'm going to have to adjust for that. So right here, same thing. It's pulling up a little bit. I want you to be able to see the needle tip working. So right here, a little bit of textures right there. And I'm creating textures with those whip motions. And right here, for example, so here is a perfect example of my ongoing learning. So how I would have done this is I would have just simply outlined this right here and then filled all of that in. That's exactly the opposite of what I want to do to get the results that I'm trying to get. So how I'm going to go about this is I'm just simply going to use a series of small dashes like so. So I'm going to start right here, kind of establishing that boundary. And then from here, I can kind of build off this way and then go back to applying these areas with a series of whip motions and tapers. So still avoided any sort of prominent hard lining, and then now I'm just adding a little bit of shading there to kind of help blend and saturate a little bit more to fill in space there, so that way there's not so much open space here. And then all I'm going to do is just continue with these techniques until I've got the results that I've desired, which is pretty darn close at this point. I think if I had to go back over it, maybe once or two more times, and that's it. If it's not already there, maybe just a little bit over here. But that's the idea of ongoing learning, is to know when to be able to use what technique to get what result we need. Again, when we're doing realistic sort of designs, there is a lot that can go wrong, and there is a lot that needs to be considered when doing these sort of styles. That's why I feel like it involves a lot of ongoing learning. Although this may not be hyper realistic to some, this is great still for a tattoo that'll hold up for the test of time. So I feel like this is still fantastic right here. It looks texturized, it does read like an eyebrow, so the results that I set out were accomplished. I'm going to kind of approach the exact same way with the eyelashes. As I mentioned earlier, back when I started, I would have simply outlined each lash first and then kind of went about it by filling each one in, which is exactly the opposite of what I want to be doing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify my point A and B. So for example, I'm going to start right here, and then I'm going to identify my point A, and I'm going to use a series of whip motions as I have to apply these areas. So right here, I'm going to use a taper, as you see, just like that. And then you're going to notice I'm going to do a series of kind of like whip back and forth motions up until this point. And then I'm going to do the same thing that way. So there's going to be absolutely no filling in at all. Just textures all the way until I've completed this area. Now the reason why I'm still not doing any sort of hard lining is because the hard lining has a sort of different depth to it and a different technique. So when we start hard lining things, that technique is going to show through, and that's exactly what we don't want, especially if we're going for realistic sort of results. We want to stay away from hard lining and be able to trust the techniques that we're using to apply. So for example, right here, I'm going to kind of override the lashes for right now and do this area behind here. And you're going to see that I'm not going to outline it or anything. I'm just going to use a series of dashes and tallies, so to speak, to apply this area like this. And then just a series of whip motions with a taper out. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and wipe away, see the results. If I need to touch anything up, I will. Since I don't, I'm going to kind of continue here. And the same thing. So since I'm using a 3-round liner, I'm able to really capture that sort of eyelash integrity, which is what I am going for. And then from here, I'm going to kind of just continue to work this stencil using a series of these whip motions. And I think this is where a lot of things can go south. So for example, all of this area, there's no like definitive line. All I need to do is just kind of boundarize. So right here, I'm going to use a couple of tallies to reach my next point. Here's an eyelash, a couple of tallies so I reach my next point. And what I'm doing is I'm essentially creating a boundary while avoiding any sort of hard lining. And that boundary is going to keep me on track and keep the structure and integrity of this sort of realistic design. So that's how I get from space to space here to keep the overall integrity. So the same thing, a couple of whip motions to kind of create that boundary going still. And then from here, I'm going to begin filling in this area until we reach the top, and then I'm going to finish with some whip motions like so. Same thing right here. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and put some ointment on, wipe away. And you can see that I still have the integrity right here. So right here is still all taken care of. And then from here, what I can start doing is filling in this area like so. And then extending this down this way right here. Since this area is already going to be saturated, I don't really need to kind of follow any sort of routine, or I'm sorry, any sort of formula here. What I need to do is just reach a certain level of saturation and worrying about varying tones. So that's what I'm going to be mindful of, applying this inner area right here. But the point is, that's how I'm going to tackle that, and that's how I'm going to tackle that area right there, avoiding hard lining completely. Some more ongoing learning would consist of me knowing where to shade and how to go about shading, what needle to use. So more ongoing learning is the fact that I'm using a 3-round liner to apply this design. Others would use a mag. For me, my ongoing learning has led me to feel comfortable using a 3-round liner. So that's why I'm exhausting that ongoing learning process. It's better to kind of go through the motions of learning lining, shading, dot work, textures, packing, all of that before we start accepting designs that require all of those techniques. So right here, for example, I'm going to go ahead and kind of use a series of whip motions, stipple shading here to create a bit of a shade right here. And then I'm going to kind of cross hatch it this way. Kind of tie everything in together, so to speak. And then from here I can dab, apply some ointment, wipe away, see where we are at. And kind of do the same thing down here. I wouldn't say this is necessarily hyper-realism. However, this is definitely on the track to doing realistic tattoos. We have to be able to apply something like this without dominant lining. There we go. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is hard lining right here because it involves a lot of fluctuation in depth as well as heavier tapers on the starts and end points, where lining requires micro tapers on the start and ends and a consistent depth to get a consistent line weight all the way across. So they are definitely not the same, and I do feel like it's important to understand that as well. So if you stayed like this far in the video and you're hearing this, that's really good, as this information I feel is really helpful when we are kind of figuring out these techniques. And the same thing right here. And kind of begin building right here. So you can see I'm really emphasizing those tapers on the end to kind of give it that sort of eyelash texture. That's what really gives it that read. That's what a viewer who's looking at the tattoo when it's healed and or completed is going to be focused in on. So those are the areas that we really want to get right. Those tapers are really, really important. And again, that also comes from ongoing learning, being able to understand why certain things need to be certain ways and the importance of certain things, and even just knowing about a read when a tattoo is completed, how it's going to read is also very important. A little bit of hard lining right there. I feel like it's necessary right there. So that's why I went ahead and added it there, to have that line weight fluctuation like that, which kind of creates a sort of like textured feel. Same thing right here. I'm going to kind of just use a series of whips here. So you can see though, as I'm thinking out loud, I know what to do just because I'm able to call upon any of these techniques as I need. And then from here I can also go back to the shading as I mentioned earlier, apply some shading as I see fit in the places that I need. Now I was tempted to kind of keep this in a, or go via time lapse here. However, instead, I feel like it may be beneficial to maybe even make this into a follow along. So I may even provide the stencil for you, so that way you can follow along and do this with me here. So the same thing. So to work these areas right here, for example, I'm still going to avoid any sort of dominant hard lining. I'm going to use a series of whip motions here, going back and forth like this. Taper out like so. Same rule of thumb applies. Just going to use a series of kind of tally-like motions here. To build this eyelash area. Just light circular motions to add a little bit of saturation there, so that way if there's any spots in between that could have been like punched in with dots, let's fill those in a little bit. And then from here I'm going to kind of repeat that same process, so staying true to the integrity of the stencil as cleanly as I can. And that's the process of, I feel, or I guess this is like a basic process to like a entry level realism. Being able just to trust the process and application of it all is a very big step in the right direction. So if you've gotten this far and you're able to get results that you didn't think that you can get, then I would consider this to be a good win. So you're going to see I'm using a series of whip motions here to saturate closer to the edge right here. And then right here, I'm still not going to use any sort of hard lining at all. I'm not going to go ahead and align it. What I'm going to do is just use the same thing. I'm just going to use a series of tallies, as you can see. This is more like pendulum motions, but it can be interpreted as tallies here, to kind of establish my boundary so that way I'm not going to go past that. And then here, I'm going to begin to lightly establish these boundaries using a series of kind of like micro tallies, I guess, so to speak. Since I'm trying to get textures here, I'm not hard line the way I normally would like this, I'm picking up every time. So that's why it appears that I'm shaking, but I'm not. I'm actually picking up and doing micro tallies here. So that's how I'm going to do these more textured areas that are in here. And the same thing right here. Just a series of whip motions, and that sort of read, believe it or not, is still far different from a hard line. So that's something that we'll also have to take into consideration and kind of, I guess, trial and error. Like if you have fake skin to try it on, I would recommend trying what I'm saying here and then seeing it for yourself, so that way you know the actual results and the differences between hard lining and building up that sort of line. So to me, it does look as though it's reading sort of more realistic than it is a sort of hard line design. So I feel like I'm on the right track here. And for me, I've been dabbling more into sort of realistic designs, as I kind of wanted to push myself and challenge everything that I've learned, just to kind of see my capabilities and to see if this is something that I'm capable of. One thing's for sure is when I first started, I didn't expect to even let alone be able to shade ever. So to be doing sort of designs like this, I'm genuinely grateful for. I could definitely feel and see the progress. So if you remain patient and go through the process and do all the footwork, you should reap very similar rewards. So I'm still avoiding any sort of prominent hard lining. So I feel like that would be it for like the eyebrow area on the outside. You can see most of it's been established and connected with these tallies that I mentioned earlier here. If I want to kind of texturize any more areas, then what I would do is just simply go back to the areas where I want more emphasis on, and I would simply repeat the exact same motions as I've been showing you here. That doesn't change. And then from here, I can begin applying saturation to these inner areas. So right here, same thing. Going to use a series of kind of whip pendulum-like motions and go back and forth. To kind of fill in and connect here. Dab away. Then the direction that I started in, I'm going to essentially keep that direction going. This is a little bit different of a technique than the technique that was used to apply the eyelashes. However, if applied correctly, it should blend together just nicely. So I'm going to use textured circular motions to kind of smooth out and connect. Same thing right here, so you're going to notice that there's a little glare here that I see, unless the stencil is just messing up, but I'm going to read it as a glare. And to do that, I'm just going to use, again, a series of small tally-like motions to boundarize that glare. And I don't go past into it there. If I don't like the way that it reads, if I feel like it reads funny, then I'll just simply go over it. But it doesn't hurt to try. I'm going to use a series of back and forth motions here, following the eyebrow hair here as well, just to give it more of an organic flow. And these are all things that I wouldn't have been able to do if I didn't have ongoing learning involved within my tattooing. We have to stay learning. We have to keep practicing. As I mentioned, I have many workbooks that are dedicated to just developing, so you can use a tattoo machine and a ballpoint pen cartridge, literally develop any time and any place. That's not what this video is about. It's more about the process of approaching realism and kind of an introduction to understanding it. However, I just figured I'd mention them because those resources are in fact available. So the same thing here, I'm just essentially making this boundary a little bit more bold so I can use pendulum motions in these surrounding areas. Like so. And right here I'm using pendulum kind of like circular motions. You see like small circular motions like so to fill in this space. So I pretty much made it through this entire application here without having to do any sort of prominent hard lining at all. Didn't feel the need to do any sort of prominent hard lining. The closest that I got to hard lining were these areas and some of the lashes and maybe this area right here. Other than that though, I kind of stayed true to the sort of realistic application and still applied it with a realistic sort of technical approach. I'm gonna go ahead and look at everything. So right here, this kind of just reads as a spot that is not supposed to be there. So I'm just gonna kind of fill that in there so that way it doesn't read like that. Now all I have to do is finalize any last things that I don't like. For example, this spot that didn't go away. If there's any other areas that I want to saturate, I can also do that. But pretty much from here on out, it's pretty much home free. It's just really about adding my personal preference and being real technical with how I want things. So I'm going to kind of finish with a little bit of shading and a little bit more saturation. And I feel like I can call it a day here. So I'm gonna kind of shade right here with some pendulum motions. I'm gonna do small shades right here. I'm going to do a light shade right here and then one more over the existing area right here. Like so. I'm going to wipe away. And this is a part of the process that again involves ongoing learning. As I said hundreds of times in this video, this is more about my personal preference and how I want it to read, different tones that I want. This right here would just simply be totally 110% my artistic preference in terms of, you know, how I want to shade, what needle I want to use, what I feel comfortable using, all of that. Artistic preference. Here is a close-up look at the final results. Please note that the idea is not to get hyper-realistic results, as this is an introduction to realism. The idea for this video is to step outside of our comfort zone and to finish applying this design from beginning to end without applying any sort of hard lining and using techniques that we may not be comfortable with. So if there is anything to take from this video, is that ongoing learning is a definite part of the process and it's something that we have to do. There's no way around the progression but through it. I feel like this would be a great place to conclude this video right here. Should you have any questions at all, I encourage you to drop a comment down below. I will do my best to assist you in the best possible direction. Before you go, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring that bell, as I will be bringing more videos like this. I also have social medias under the same name as my YouTube. I have Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok, all under Daniel Yuck. I would appreciate the support over there as well. Don't forget to thumbs up this video and share it with a friend if you think they'd find this helpful. With that being said, I appreciate you, your time, and your support. Have a great day.
Are you wanting to develop your tattooing skill sets? Now you can practice and develop anytime, any place with an assortment of tattooing workbooks that I've created. With these assorted tattooing workbooks, we can practice our basic lining all the way to advanced lining. We can practice shading, shading placement, dot work, textures, and more. All we are gonna need is a tattoo workbook of mine. We can use a pencil, pen. We can even use a tattoo machine with a ballpoint cartridge to develop our tattooing abilities further. That means that we don't need tattoo ink, we don't need napkins or petroleum jelly to get to practicing. Simply open one of my tattooing workbooks and get going. It really is that easy. You can get your hands on one of my developmental tattooing assorted workbooks by simply clicking the links in my description or in the pinned comment section below, or navigating on over to Amazon.com, typing in Daniel Yuck, and you'll see all of the assorted tattoo workbooks that I've created come up. If you have an Amazon account, be sure to follow my Amazon author page as well, as I would greatly appreciate your support. Should you have any questions at all, drop them in the comment section down below. I will do my best to assist you in the best possible direction.